for today is from the first letter of the Corinthians, chapter 13, verses 4 through 13. Paul describes love, its characteristics, and how it functions. Paul compares and contrasts love with other virtues, specifically faith, hope, and love. Faith, the right relationship to God, makes love possible, and God is the ground for all hope. Because love is eternal, it gives perspective to the Corinthians, longing for gifts that are transient. And love is the greatest lack the Corinthians have. Follow along on page 934 as I read our text. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. But as for prophecies, they will come to an end. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will come to an end. For we know only in part, and we prophesy only in part. But when the complete comes, the partial will come to an end. When I was a child, I spoke like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became an adult, I put an end to childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then we will see face to face. Now I know only in part. Then I will know fully, even as I have been fully known. And now faith, hope, and love abide, these three, and the greatest of these is love. May God bless the hearing, reading, and understanding of this word.
Thank you, Sean. One person can only do so much. We've heard that before. One person can only do so much. After all, there's a lot that you and I that we have to do. And I know that for many of us, we experience this life as overwhelming, and so it's easy for us to say, I just give up. I can't possibly make a difference. There's nothing that I could probably do. On Wednesday, our youth group took part in a little bit of ninja leaf raking. After dark, we went to our neighbors around the church here. We asked them permission first, but we asked them if we could rake their leaves. We asked them if we could jump in their leaves too. And some of us did, and some of us lost our phones while we jumped in there, and we found them later. I was thankful for that. But I was really, really thankful on youth showed up to help do some leaf raking. I was really, really thankful that John showed up as a chaperone to help me rake some leaves because, you see, I had promised to some of our neighbors that we would go out and rake some leaves. And I was a little bit nervous that I was going to be the only one to rake leaves. And if that were the case, there's nothing I can do. The job is too much. How, after all, could one person pick up all of those leaves all by themselves? How in the world could one person make a difference? One person can only do so much, right? We hear that, we tell ourselves that. The tasks in front of us, they are just too big to do. Rather than thinking about how one person can only do so much, I want to encourage you to think about that in a little bit of a different way. And I want to encourage you to take on that only and to think how one person can do so much. We've seen an example of that today in the lighting of these candles here. You have experienced that in your life. People who have been examples of faith. People who have taught you how to live. We remember on All Saints' Day all of those who have gone on before us and who have been example of faith, and how that one person, how much they have done for you and for me. One person can only do so much, or one person can do so much. It's perhaps a matter of matter of perspective. Throughout 14 weeks in the fall here, we're on week 12 today. Throughout 14 weeks in the fall, we have been asking 14 questions that seem to always come up when we read the Bible. I've been basing this sermon series off of Rob Bell's book, What is the Bible? And we've been thinking through 14 questions that always come up. Today, we ask this question. What's the best question to ask when you're reading the Bible? When you open Scripture to any place, what's the most important question to ask when you are reading the Bible? Here's the most important question to ask. Why was this important enough that somebody took the time to write it down? Why was this story, why was this illustration, why was this image, why was this illustration, why was this parable, why was it important enough that somebody took the time to write it down, to record it, and to pass it on? Why was this piece of Scripture important enough to be written down? And why did it pass the test of time that it still remains for us a piece of Scripture? Why was this important enough to be written down? Now, that brings us to a broader question of who was this story, this illustration, this image, who was originally intended for? Why was this written down? Now, I know that when Sean read that text from 1 Corinthians, a lot of you were expecting a bride and a groom to walk down the center aisle, because most often we hear that verse from 1 Corinthians, we hear it at weddings. My guess is that many of you had that piece of Scripture as a part of your wedding service. Folks, patient, folks, kind of. We think about that text in the context of a wedding. Now, I don't want to burst your bubble, but that text that Sean read, it wasn't originally intended for a wedding. Now, typically it's read for a wedding, but it wasn't written for a wedding. It was originally written to a community of early believers who were struggling with how to live with one another. You see, they had gotten into some pretty terribly destructive habits of tearing one another down, putting themselves first and thinking about everyone else as last. I mean, I'm really glad that was a piece of Scripture that was a problem for the Corinthians. I know that none of us experience those problems anymore, right? This piece of Scripture wasn't written for a wedding, but it fits because it's talking about relationship with one another and how to live with one another. When the Apostle Paul is writing this text to his church in Corinth, what Paul is doing is he's trying to stoke a movement. He's trying to spread an intoxicating message that there is another way to be in the world. What he's saying is that the good news of Jesus is about human dignity and goodness. He even uses the phrase new humanity, or to make it local, new life. New life in Jesus Christ. The people that he's interacting with, the people in his early church, they are stuck in all sorts of old and destructive modes of being. They're not getting to it as quickly as he'd like it. And Paul is frustrated. He loves them, and he's full of hope, but he's at wit's end. He cares deeply, and there's also something driving him crazy. He's suffering for his work, but his work is also doing something profound in him. What he's having to do is to address really practical matters to his early church, like who eats the treats after worship first? Who should budge into the front of the line? Who should go first? What he's talking about is really practical matters like food, and like who's sleeping with whom, and about about what's the proper length of hair, or whether hair should be covered or uncovered. He's talking about marriage. And he's also writing things like love is patient, like love is kind. What's the best question to ask? What's the most important question? What's the best question to ask when you're reading the Bible? This question: why was this important enough to be written down? Why did this story, why did this illustration, why did this image survive the test of time? Why was this important enough to be written down? Or another way to ask that question is, why are the creation stories so important for us? If Scripture, if the Bible is the source and norm for our lives, if it grounds us and if it tells us how to live, why the creation stories? Well, the poems in Genesis, they're written in the Old Testament exile, in a time of chaos and in confusion, in a time of persecution, and in a time of separation from what they would know as home. And the creation stories then reveal a belief in a God that is powerful, more powerful than their situation, and more powerful and active and present in this world, moving it to a better place. What those creation stories tell us is that God is not satisfied with the way things used to be, but that God has an ideal and a hope for this world and for our lives. What's the best question to ask when you're reading the Bible? Why was this important enough to be written down? And how does it change me? How does it impact me? How does it change my life? Do I believe that it can have an influence on me today, on my family, on my work, on my relationships? Long ago, how can it still speak to us today? How can I believe in the Bible? Rachel Held Evans, a Christian author who wrote a really wonderful book called Inspired, comes at it this way. She says that perhaps a better question than do I believe in the Bible is, am I acting like I do? Perhaps a better question than do I believe in the Bible is, am I acting like Am I feeding the hungry? Am I caring for the sick? Am I holding the hands of the homeless? Am I offering help to addicts? Am I working to break down religious and political barriers that marginalize ethnic and religious minorities and people with disabilities? Am I behaving as though life is more than a meaningless, chaotic mess and that there is some order in the storm? That's what the Bible tells us. That life is more than chaos, that there is order, and that your life, that my life has meaning. But then we're back to that idea of one person can only do so much. And after all, I'm full of failure, I'm full of sin, I'm full of disappointment. Why do these stories survive the test of time? Why do these characters in Scripture, why do they still speak to us? Let me give you a list. Noah. John, help me out. No? There. Noah got drunk. And Abraham was too old. And Isaac was a daydreamer. Used by his family. Moses was a murderer who had a stuttering problem. Gideon was afraid. Samson had long hair. He was afraid too. Rahab was a prostitute. Jeremiah and Timothy were too young. David was a murderer and an adulterer. Elijah, the prophet Elijah, he was suicidal. Bankrupt. John the Baptist, well, he ate bugs. Peter denied Christ. The disciples fell asleep while they were praying. Martha worried about everything. Mary Magdalene, she was demon-possessed. The Samaritan woman, she was divorced more than once. Zacchaeus was too small. Paul was a murderer. Timothy had an ulcer. Lazarus was dead. One person can only do so much, right? So what about your story and your life? What's the only? Well, I could help if only I clean up my own life first, if only I get my life in order first, if only. One person can only do so much, right? One story in Scripture, it can only do so much. What's the most important question to ask when you're reading the Bible? Why were these stories important enough to be written down? And then this. What about you? Why is your life important? For God declares His love and His grace and His acceptance of you. But one person can only do so much, right? Thanks be to God. That one person can do so much in inspiring and in giving life, in giving hope, and in cheering us on, and in bringing us to faith. All of these candles behind me, they all illustrate, they all demonstrate for us all of those people who have been that one person for us, who have brought us to faith, who have taught us about Jesus, who have been an example of saintly living. And each one of these candles represents saints who also had a little bit of a darker side too. I mean, if we're honest with ourselves, we all recognize that all of these people, they have inspired us and something else too. We have this long list of people who have been saints and sinners in Scripture. And you too. You are included in that list today. You are included in that list today. But then again, one person can only do so much, or one person can do so much. Amen.